Okay, so what we're going to cover tonight is Genesis 12:10 through 14:24. So, Diane, would you like to open us in prayer? Okay, so once again, we'll take a look at our affirmations that we begin with every session. God creates creation and has a specific purpose for it. The relationship between God and creation develops through speaking and listening. God's word to creation is a sovereign call, but it's a kind of call which invites obedience rather than demands allegiance. God loves creation, but creation refuses to let God be God. And finally, the relationship between God and creation is marked by tension between God's purposes and creation's resistance to God's purposes. Sometimes that resistance is not intentional, but it's just the nature of it's just human nature. Sometimes we resist God without intending to. We get wrapped up in our own lives, or we get caught up in our own needs, and we act outside of what God intends for us. And so it's not rebellion necessarily, but it's straying, which I only mention that because we're going to kind of cover that. We're going to come into face-to-face with that in the material that we cover tonight. So, set the stage a little bit for the stories or the tension that's going on in this material. Who was your role model growing up? Okay, so is your mother? Teacher? Some of the ladies in the community? Okay. So what were the characteristics that made them a role model? For you, it was their faith? Right. Okay. So they had a strong sense of right and wrong, which was, and it was clear for you, so that was a characteristic that you wanted to model yourself after. Partly because you didn't want to disappoint them, but partly because you admired it, right? How about what characteristics did? Okay. So you admired their courage. And there was a fear of, they were confident in front of people, and that was something you were not and you wanted. And you saw them. Did that get better for you? Not really? A little bit. How about you, Donna? What are the characteristics of your mother that you They didn't want the baggage of a child. No, it wouldn't be something she would share with you. So the characteristics you admire were strength, her knowledge and comfort with what she believed and what was important to her. Yeah. So she knew who she was about. Okay. As you became an adult, were there any role models that kind of emerged to kind of take their place? Yeah, or to go with, so that maybe they never. It's not like the people that you started with as your role model stopped being a role model, but some others maybe took more immediate precedence. Arts people in college or where? Oh, all your life. And then you have a daughter who's in the arts. All three of them, yeah. How about you, Marilyn? Was there anybody that kind of, in a way, followed or also became role models as you grew up? Oh, okay. Okay. I think a lot of you can guess who my role model growing up. You think? And your mom, my mom. As I got older and moved away from home, again, my dad never stopped being a role model, but there were other people that I admired and tried to emulate in a certain extent. Campus minister when I was in college. The senior pastor when I was out in California. He became like a mentor. So there's different people. Again, they never replaced my father, but they certainly added to. Okay, here's a probably a little bit more difficult question. Knowing that everybody's human and nobody's perfect, were there any characteristics of your role models that you didn't admire? What were those? Okay. With my father, there were a couple things that drove me crazy. He was our family's designated warrior. And it would get excessive sometimes. Affect his health. He could also be pretty stubborn. And what frustrated all of us kids is he was kind of old school, where he didn't want us to get a big head. You know that thing? So we didn't find out how, when we were growing up and going through high school, we didn't know how much he admired us unless we talked to our siblings, because he would always talk to a sibling about how much he would, when I'd ride around with him, he would talk about how great my older brother was. And what I didn't know was he was really living all my exploits and all my achievements with my older sister. And you know, and so he would talk to a sister or a brother about, but he wasn't as comfortable saying that to us individually. He got better towards the end of life. He could show his admiration to us directly, but when we were growing up, it was difficult for him. So that was a difficult thing, and it was just human nature for him. You know, there wasn't any qualities that caused me to disrespect my dad, but there were certain qualities that I wish he didn't have. Yeah, there's a couple of extra questions there that were actually from last week. So, we get to Genesis 10 through Genesis 12:10 through Genesis 13:18. And there are two narratives going on here. There's a narrative of Abraham in Egypt, and then there's a narrative of Abraham and Lot. And I forgot to bring my Bible down here, I think. Yeah. I'll grab one up here. Gave me an excuse to go get my water anyway. Okay. So, 12:10 through 20. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and then they will kill me. But they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account." When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and be gone." And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they sent him on the way, with his wife and all that he had. So that's the first story. What do you think of Abram in that story? He lied. Who was he thinking about? Himself. Was he thinking about Sarai? Was he thinking about God? Most scholars believe that this is an later addition into this narrative is a later addition into the story, because it breaks away from the narrative, the overall narrative. The overall narrative is that God calls Abram because Abram is Abram is faithful. And then after this story, it picks up where Abram is faithful again. And so this is a break. They also believe that it's a connection with with the culture at the time, and another culture bleeding in to what was to become Israel's culture. Because it was fairly common at that time in certain cultures at the time that husbands would adopt their wives as their sisters, so that the woman would have a higher standing in the community. As a sister, the sister of a rich man had a higher standing than the wife of a rich man. So sometimes the man would adopt his wife as a sister so that she could have more say. She could have more prestige in the community. Doesn't make sense in today's terms why that would be. In fact, and it seems to go against other places in Scripture. Therefore, leave your family and cleave to your wife, where there seems to be a priority of the wife over the family. But that was not the culture at the time. So Brueggemann, who I turn to, says that Abraham, to give him somewhat of a break, was doing what he saw was necessary to survive. Rightly or wrongly, he believed that if they knew that she was his wife, they would kill him and take her as his wife, their wife, because she was so beautiful. First of all, what does that say about the Egyptians? It's kind of a dig at the Egyptians, where there wasn't any Egyptian woman as beautiful as Sarai. It's kind of hard to believe. There's beautiful people anywhere. Pharaoh could have had any woman. Sarai was the most beautiful woman in the world. Remember how old they were. They were older. Right. But still, so they were still, so they lived longer, so that the age was more relative to their time, and so they. Yeah. It still strikes me as odd that they thought. Yeah. No, there's no doubt that she was a beautiful woman in her. That she obviously was a woman of great beauty. So, first of all, this story is all about survival. Because, first of all, Abram has to leave the land where he was, the land that was promised to him, because there was a famine. So he had to go into Egypt, and it's a different culture altogether. And he has nothing. He is powerless. So, being powerless, going to a different land because you have no way of feeding yourself otherwise, puts you in a different mindset. And so he was operating out of a sense of fear for his life. So he was doing those things that he thought necessary to live. Other aspect about the story that seems strange or seems incongruous is Pharaoh is essentially punished by God for what? He has plagues on his family. The Pharaoh, by the story, is pretty innocent in this whole story, right? He's lied to. He thinks that he's doing something perfectly fine. This beautiful woman is this man's sister. There's nothing wrong with me marrying her. And yet he experiences plagues from God as a result. So that seems to be incongruous. Why is God punishing an innocent man for something that he didn't intend to do? And Abraham is in a sense rewarded, because when Pharaoh thinks that Sarah is Abram's sister and he marries her, he gives Abram a dowry. Slaves, oxen, donkeys, all these things that make him wealthy. And Abraham gets to keep them when he leaves. How is that justice? That becomes a question in this story. Is Abraham's acting on his own, straying away from God, and God is protecting him. So there's a different relationship going on here between God and humankind than what we saw before. When people strayed from God earlier in Genesis, what happens? They receive the consequences. But with Abram, he doesn't. So there's a closer bond going on. So that's one story in the narrative, the first narrative. The second narrative is in chapter 13. One through 14. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into Negev. There's another break from the story, is the previous story has no mention of Lot in all of this. But now Lot's back in the story. So what scholars believe is that that's some more evidence of why maybe this story about Abram going into Egypt was a later addition, because it's different. It seems to be a break from the narrative of Abram, Sarai, and Lot continuing. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. He journeyed on by stages from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. So after he went to Egypt, he went back to where he was before he went to Egypt, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them living together, for their possessions were so great that they could not live together. And there was strife between the herders of Abram's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land. So not only did you have Abram and Lot with all their possessions and with their herds, you also had the other tribes, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herders and my herders, for we are kindred. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." Lot looked about him and saw that the plain of the Jordan was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the plain and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Raise your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Rise up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So now, there's a different problem that's being faced. The first problem was famine combined with foreign power. That's what Abram was facing in the first story. In this story, the problem is competition. Or lack of resources. Abram made his own decisions here in the first story. He decided to take matters in his own hands. In this story, his attitude was much different. In this story, he says, "Lot, take whatever land you want." He's essentially saying it doesn't matter where I live because God's going to take care of me. I'm not worried. Here, he operates out of fear. Here, he operates out of faith. There's a difference. So now we have, now Abram is returned to the model of faith. There's a belief also in the scholars that this particular narrative may have served tribal purposes. In other words, it came to explain how different people settled to different places, why certain tribes were served in one place and certain tribes were another. So it became a rationale. Well, we understand why certain tribes were located in certain places because of the agreement between Abram and his nephew Lot. That's how things got divided. So then trust in God is represented in different situations. And this is what probably makes the most sense in human nature. You have two different threats. One is a threat to your actual life, survival, either starving or being killed by a foreign power. And the other is comfort. How comfortable is your life going to be? And conflict within your family. One is a direct threat to your life. The other is a direct threat to convenience. Abram is able to keep his faith in the latter story when it's a threat to convenience. He says, okay, I'm going to trust that God is going to lead us through this. But when it came to his life, his faith was less powerful, less present. So that juxtaposition between the two stories is that they are concerned with different realities. And And that sharp conflict is what it reflects as the complexity of being human in the world. Things aren't always simple. They're usually, sometimes they're not black and white, right? And sometimes, in some situations, it's harder to take on faith, take it by faith, than at other times. What was the worst thing that was going to happen in the second story? Abram and Lot and their people might become estranged, and they might still live there but just not get along. What's the worst thing that could happen in the first story? Abram could die. So we have different levels. Our life in this world, even back then and now, there's different levels of our challenge of faith. Some challenges we can manage our faith just fine. We can trust God just fine, thank you very much. But other times, having faith in God is a lot harder. Especially when it comes to life and death. Not just of us, but the people we care for. If we have a child that's sick, how easy it is to just leave it to God. Quite naturally, and in a lot of ways quite appropriately, we turn to the experts we see. And we do whatever we can, and we say, God, I don't know if you're there or not, but I'm not taking any chances. But when it comes to, okay, do I move to another community, which may be more expensive to live, but there's it's a better position. How do I make that choice? I'm going to trust God on this. I'm going to go by my gut because I think that's what God is telling me to do, and I'm going to pray about it. And I'm going to take God's guidance on this. Because what's the worst thing that could happen? You could just stay at your job. That's what makes human condition more complicated. And that's what the juxtaposition of these two stories brings out. When it was easy, Abram's faith was strong and true. And when it was tougher, Abram was more human. He was more of a role model when it was easy than when it was hard. There were some times growing up where I saw my dad struggle with his faith. Because he couldn't do anything to change things. And because he couldn't be a part of it, it was hard for him to step out of it and trust. I'm thinking specifically when my sister Julie contracted cervical cancer. And about the same time, my grandmother dementia had got to the point where she had to be in the nursing home. Both situations that Dad had little to no control over. And he struggled. He didn't lose his faith, but he struggled with faith. I remember when my sister Julie was at Mayo undergoing surgery, and my mom went with her. And so Dad was at home because we were all at college. Well, Joanne had graduated from college. She was actually living with my grandmother and teaching at a country school. But she went out to be with Dad while Mom was gone. And she was quite upset because one night Dad went in and got drunk. And he made it home. Probably shouldn't have been driving, but he made it home anyway. And Joanne could tell just by the way he was stumbling around that he had gotten drunk, and she was upset. She says, "Why didn't he trust God more? You know, why did he feel like he had to get drunk?" I remember thinking at the time, I was thinking, back off, Joanne. He was upset about his oldest daughter being at Mayo and that he was not with her and he couldn't do anything about it. He slipped up. He did a human thing. He didn't make a practice of it. It was just that night he felt guilty enough about it that and this is also a guy who he could nurse a beer all night long, so. But he had an episode where he struggled because he felt powerless. And so that's the complexity of life, and that's where our human nature meets, and our different realities meet our attempts to live our lives in faith. Sometimes we're more successful than another depending on the reality and the situation we're facing. And sometimes the more severe of the crisis brings out the stronger faith, but sometimes it also brings out more doubts. And that's the struggle we have in the lives of faith. And Abraham shows that in clear contrast, or Abram does. And for me, this is what makes the Old Testament so valuable. Because the human beings in the Old Testament are real. We can imagine ourselves in this situation making sometimes the same decisions. Now, I don't think I could ever imagine when I was married telling somebody that I was afraid of that she was my sister. But I can imagine maybe out of fear, not standing up to a bully like maybe I should to protect somebody else. I don't know. We don't always know how we're going to react. So that's the humanity of what we're dealing with. Okay. So that's the first part of the reading. Second part of the reading comes in Genesis 14. And this is, I'm not going to read this particular chapter. You can read it along, but there are a lot of names in this chapter that are fairly difficult to read, and I could probably get through them a little bit with my history of Hebrew, but I'm afraid I'm just going to butcher the heck out of them. So a couple issues we have to think about. First of all, the historical data, as far as the names and how it fits, there is no historical data that either supports or disputes the data about that time and who was operating at that time and who was king and who wasn't king. There's not really, the historical data is pretty obscure. It's hard to find. So the biblical account the account we read in Genesis is pretty much one of the only accounts that we can find at the time, even of comparative cultures. Second issue is that Abram's intervention on behalf of Lot seems to not fit. So at the beginning, they're talking about kind of an international battle going on. All these different tribes, there's certain invaders coming into the area seeking to take control, but there's already kings and tribes, nations already existing, small tribal leaders or kings already existing, and they're kind of making agreements with each other to kind of repel this force of these people coming in. And it's kind of hard to negotiate all the things going on, but it's pretty clear that there's kind of an international battle going on over the land of people already existing there and certain people coming in and trying to take over, and there's battle back and forth, and there's different alliances being made and then not being made, and so it's fairly chaotic going on. And then all of a sudden we have this rather specific story that involves Abram and Lot, where Lot is captured by one of these invading armies and taken. And so Abram gets all his slaves, forms his own army, and goes and rescues Lot. So we go from a kind of a larger point of view to a more focused point of view. And that transition between the two is rather abrupt. So it doesn't kind of, and then all of a sudden, then we'll go back to kind of the larger point of view. So that particular episode of Lot, of why Abram thought he had to go and save Lot when there was other people operating that could have probably done it. What does that say, except for the purpose behind it is that Abram is, the story kind of, again, continues the narrative of Abram being the chosen one of God. And so who's going to save Lot? Well, Abram, of course, is, because Abram has a special power. And he's more equipped to. Even though there's kings, he's more equipped to save his nephew. So, and then the account ends with a character Melchizedek. And the reason why a lot of people focus on Melchizedek in this particular story is that this king or this person, there's a reference made to him in the New Testament in the book of Hebrews, where Jesus is considered to be a high priest in the lineage of Melchizedek. So we have a specific reference from the New Testament to this character. So we think, well, this must be a very important person for the writer of Hebrews to mention him. But when you read the actual narrative, he's barely mentioned. He's almost an accidental character. At the very end, he blesses Abram. And that's it. That's all we have for mention. So why is he so important that he's mentioned in Hebrews? What Brueggemann argues is that he's kind of an incidental character, but what makes him significant to the writer of Hebrews is that because he is blessing Abram, then he has some sort of position over Abram that only a superior has the power to bless, has a power where the blessing means something. So Melchizedek must be in that time more important than Abram in order for Abram to value his blessing. And so for when Hebrews is saying that Jesus is like Melchizedek, Melchizedek as a person isn't that important, but as a metaphor of how important Jesus is, that's why the connection is being made. Does that make sense? Yeah. It says, well, let's look at that part. It says, yeah. So who do you pay a tithe to? Yes. But why would you pay a tithe? Right. So then that makes sense of why Jesus is connected with him. Where before Melchizedek was the example of the high priest, the highest priest. Now Jesus is. So that's the connection with Hebrews. What's also clear in this particular, the tithe itself, when we think of tithing to the church, we're thinking of, okay, this is what we decide to do. It's a free will offering. It's an offering. We make an offering, and we may consider it important, but it's not, we're not going to be kicked out of the church if we don't tithe to the church, right? There's some people that might believe that we should, but that's not the way churches operate. They ask for the tithe. They may ask strongly for the tithe, but they're not going to say you no longer belong in this church because you don't tithe enough. So we have an idea of a tithe being our choice, a free will. But the sense we get in this passage is that it's not a tithe in that sense. It's an obligation. You have to pay. It's obligatory, not free will. But what comes clear in this whole passage is that Abram's faith remains clear. So Abram starts a man of faith, strong faith that is called by God. He kind of has a hiccup. He returns to his faith, and then he shows his strong faith. A faith strong enough that he's willing to go to meet enemies to save his nephew. And also, when the king of Sodom says, okay, take the spoils. You won, take the spoils. Take anything you want. You won the battle, you got your nephew, go ahead, take it. It's yours. What's Abram's response? I'm not going to take anything because I'm not going to be owing anyone but God. Which is different than the way he operated with Pharaoh. He had no problems taking his riches. But in this case, he takes his riches. Yeah. There was some time that passed, but what was clear was that when Abram went to Egypt, he didn't have anything. And he came away from, at least during the time of Egypt, he gained things, and I think he got started by Pharaoh. Which could have just been happened where Abram just shared the wealth. It doesn't say anything different in the scriptures.
No, but it doesn't say that Abraham gave it to him either.
Could be. But it is clear, at least for Abram, he was started on his wealth through the Pharaoh. Because the Pharaoh says, and for her sake he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep and oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys and camels. Yeah. Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? I don't think so either. I don't think he took her, but I think he was intending to. And so he was, and when a person takes, here he is, Pharaoh, and he's intending to take this woman for his wife, and because the woman is not, it's because it's a patriarchal society, if he was intending to take Sarai as his wife, he would naturally pay a dowry to her brother, who was her guardian or supervisor or master. It would make sense that the Pharaoh would reward Abram through a dowry. And you certainly get that sense that Pharaoh is blessing Abram with all these things. because he's intending to take Sarai as a wife, but then he undergoes these plagues and he finds out the truth and he says, okay, just take the stuff and go. Just get out of my life.
And two, don't you think, I think there was a sense of Abraham, all through the scripture, that people sensed there was something, an alliance between him and God.
Yeah. But there's also another case, too, where there's another story of him, another king, and him pulling the same thing of saying, no, she's my sister.
And there is some evidence in the genealogy of Sarai that she was in relationship to.
Yeah, there was probably some sort of familial relationship before they got married, but she wasn't his sister. So that was clear. What's important in the story, what makes the narrative, is that in this particular narrative, Abram is not trusting God to take care of him. Even though he's going into this land, even though he has famine, first of all, there's famine. He doesn't believe that God can take care of him in the land where God sent him, so he leaves and goes to Egypt. You get a sense that that was his decision, not God's instruction to him. And secondly, he decides to pull this whole thing about Sarai being his sister. So it's God. So, and that's another thing that seems somewhat incongruous, is that Egypt, the Pharaoh, immediately goes to, these things are happening to me, and it's because it's your God that's doing it to me. He's immediately making that connection when he has no reason to, necessarily, because he doesn't have a history in the same religion. So why would he automatically bring Abram in and say, your God is punishing me? That seems also incongruous in the story, except unless you bring in what the story is being told, is that God is providing for Abram even when Abram is breaking away from him. That God is still protecting him. And so there's this differing relationship. There's a more intimate and powerful covenant between God and Abram than there is between God and Abram's predecessors. You see a more tight-knit connection. So we're starting to see a movement of God becoming more intimate with humankind through Abram. And we see that covenant becoming even stronger later when Abram becomes Abraham. So, let's skip over the expository observations. Just keep going. So, returning back to systematic theology approach, what are the things that we're dealing with as far as a systematic approach? There's some cosmology in that God is in control over nature and acts in almost a supernatural way. Eschatology is not really dealt with, but certainly ethics and epistemology is being affected. There's Abram's ethics, which seem to be he's acting very ethical in one case and very not so ethical in another. And then epistemology, as far as how Abram is understanding communication from God. Sometimes he's getting a message from God, and sometimes he's not listening. So the truth, Abram can discern the truth sometimes and can't in others. And what is being said through these stories comes into question, and there's this constant tension between what is reality and what is faith, and how reality affects faith and faith affects reality. Critical themes: God's promise. God remains true to his promise. God says, "I will protect you. You are my. I will make a great nation. I will take care of you." God doesn't lag in that promise. Even when Abram breaks away from him and does something again, shows a lack of faith in God, God remains faithful. Human condition, the human condition is complex, where, like I mentioned earlier, where sometimes it is easy to be faithful, sometimes it's a lot harder. And a lot of that is the reality in which we face. God's call to faithfulness is just simply easier to follow in certain situations and harder in others. And what Abram's story does for us is to make clear how that differences can appear and can happen. And when God becomes a priority for us and when God seems to not. Abram is reflecting very clearly in these two stories the human condition in relationship to God. So in a lot of ways, in these stories, the relationship between God and humankind becomes a lot more personal and relatable. It's no longer abstract. And that's what I got. Any questions? Dan, you have any questions? Yeah, between how they, one says intends to, and one says I meant to take, and one says I took. It's a distinction without a huge difference, because in that time, betrothed meant the same as being married. I mean, it was just stages, but it was as serious. So if Pharaoh intended to be married, then it was just like he was married. It was in that time. So it's not that it's a totally insignificant difference, but it's not something to really focus deeply on. And it's probably just a difference of interpretation of a word in Hebrew. And Hebrew is easy to interpret in both Hebrew and Aramaic, which is what the Old Testament was written in. It's fairly easy to interpret them wrongly, because with Hebrew, Hebrew is a consonantal language. I didn't spell that right. In other words, there are no vowel letters in Hebrew. It's all consonants. If you were to see an original Hebrew text, you would see there's no letters in the Hebrew alphabet that is a vowel sound or operates as a vowel. So what happened, and when they were in biblical times, when they were speaking and writing at the time, well, they just knew the words, and so they just put down the consonants, so they knew how it sounded. But later on, when the further we got away from it, the less you understood what sounds belonged there. So then, in like the 8th century, I think, there was a group of scholars, Hebrew scholars, called the Masoretes, and they decided, well, maybe we ought to make it clear when we write things of what the vowel sounds are. Well, they weren't going to add letters to the alphabet, so they just put dots and dashes around the consonants to symbolize what vowel sounds went with it. Well, just a missing of a dot or adding of would change the whole meaning of a word. So when you're trying to look through these old texts, you're saying, okay, was this original? Or was this is it this word, or is it this word that has the same consonants but has a slightly different vowel sound, so it has a different meaning? So it wasn't a perfect science. Yeah. It can't be. Because first of all, the original texts are themselves a translation or interpretation. And then when you change it to a different language, you're making an interpretation. So it's an interpretation on top of an interpretation on top of an interpretation. Add to that all the scholarship that's entered into our understanding since over the years. I mean, even since the King James Version, there's been a lot of scholarship that have added understanding and changed, deepened the interpretation of the Scriptures. Reminds me of, there's a buddy of mine from seminary, BJ, and he grew up in Oregon, and he went home, and he went home to his home church, and it was a small town in Oregon, small church, and they were talking about whether or not they wanted to replace the Bibles in the pews and change it from King James to a newer version. And this one guy stands up and gets attention. He says, if King James Version was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. All right. What I had my Old Testament professor, her name is Kathy Darr, and we were talking translations one time about what translations were good to have in this class. And she says, well, probably for to be as accurate as possible, you would probably be safer to do a newer translation like the New International Version or the New Revised Standard Version or even the Revised Standard Version or the New English Bible or something like that. But she said, I will say that as far as following the structure of how Hebrew flows, she says, you can't get better than King James. She says, its scholarship, unfortunately, is outdated, but it's, as far as the Old Testament goes, as far as it following, capturing the nature of Hebrew, it remains very true. Yeah. Well, the biggest problem with King James is it's written in the way English was spoken under King James, which is a lot different than the way we speak English now. Is that the new King James Version? Yeah. They wanted to update the King James Version